Delight Your Marriage, episode 29.
Welcome to the Delight Your Marriage podcast, the show where you hear from amazing and inspiring wives sharing their struggles, triumphs, and advice for this journey called marriage. Here's your host, Belah Rose.
Well, hello. My name is Belah Rose, and if this is your first time, I just want to say welcome, and I'm really glad that you're here. This is an opportunity where you can just spend some time investing in your marriage, and if you haven't spent time, praying for your marriage today or thinking about how you can be a better partner today, I'm just grateful that now you're tuning in, because for the next, while you're going to be able to listen to an awesome couple. And just before I introduce them, I want to once again invite you. Tonight actually is my webinar, and we've got some amazing feedback so far. I mean, God has been so kind to show up each and every time we've had this webinar, and I believe it's really helping people. So if you haven't yet come, it's called How to Love Him Most. So it's really about wives understanding biblical principles on what it means to love your husband in the bedroom. So I would love to have you. It's really a special time. Again, it's 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, and you can sign right up at delightyourmarriage.com/webinar. If you're listening to this in the future, go to that URL as well, because the next live, free, anonymous, but plenty of spice and biblical principles will be at that web address, delightyourmarriage.com/webinar. So today, Kate and Brad from One Flesh Marriage, they're going to be talking about marital intimacy and what they write about on their blog. And I just am excited. This is actually the first time I've had a couple on the show, which is a new dynamic, but it also, they each have such great insights. It's kind of pinging back and forth. So I think you're going to like that. And it's really nice to get, the female perspective, then the male perspective, and they just complement each other really well. So let's go ahead and dive in. Hello, and welcome back, Delight Your Marriage listeners. I'm really grateful to have Brad and Kate here from onefleshmarriage.com, and they are going to be talking a little bit about their journey, and this is the first time at Delight Your Marriage we have a couple on, so this is going to be fun. And welcome, Brad and Kate. I'm so glad you're here.
We're glad to be here. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I want to just dive in. Would you all kind of introduce yourself, your family, and a little bit about your day-to-day life?
Sure. Brad and I have been together for over 20 years. We've been married for 15. We were high school sweethearts. So grew up in the same area. And we now live in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And Brad is a pastor at our church. He's pastor of small groups and Reengage, which is our marriage ministry. And I am home with my kids currently, 2 of which we have in public school, and our youngest we're still homeschooling. On top of that, I do photography as a side business. And we're just passionate about marriage, because God has worked really good things in our marriage. And so we do the marriage ministry at our church, but also have our online ministry, and just really passionate about connecting with people and working on marriages and seeing how we can kind of revolutionize talking about marriage in church and getting people good information and just really getting the word out there that God's plan is good, and that though we may struggle at times, we don't have to isolate ourselves and deal with it on our own. So that's kind of where we're at currently.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I want to dive into, I feel like I already have 3 questions to ask you, but I want to, could you tell me a little bit about the both of your personalities and how that works together?
Sure. You go ahead.
Okay, both of our personalities. That's a good question. I am more the extrovert, where Kate's more an introvert, although we're kind of both a little at the middle of the scale in that. So I do get my energy from being around people, while she is much more likely to get energy from either 1 or 2 really close people or by herself. And So that's something we've had to learn how to balance. Some of the other personality things, like I think she is much more the pursuer when a conflict happens, that she has to get to a place of resolving that conflict and get through it. And I am much more the withdrawer and would rather avoid the conflict altogether. So we've had to kind of learn what that dynamic does to each of us and figure out how to meet in the middle sometimes.
Yeah, that is so true. Gosh, I feel like that's, I mean, that might even be a typical thing of, women often need to talk through it and the men often want to go into the other room.
Sometimes I've seen some couples who it's vice versa, male and female, but there's a lot of times that there's somebody who has that.
Yeah, usually it's one of each, not always.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good to hear that that's a dynamic you've had to kind of work through. What has helped you kind of work through that, Brad?
Well, here's the one part of our story that Kate didn't say along the way. Like at some of the most challenging times in our marriage, I was working on getting my master's degree in marriage and family counseling. And so that didn't really fix our marriage, but there is some times that after that I've kind of been able to pull, okay, wait, this is something we need to pay attention to or something like that. So I would say there's some helps there, but it didn't fix anything by any means. Some of it honestly has been God really working in both of us and showing us some of the places that we're both selfish and learning how the other functions is just a huge gift to them. And so I'll say easily, like there's times where Kate will go out of her way because she knows I want to avoid something, and she'll say, it's okay, we can have this conversation later, it's fine, and give me that space. And that then sometimes makes me go, no, you know what, I know you need to get through it, so let's talk, or those kind of things. So sometimes the giving and the opposite really helps.
Oh, I see. Oh, that's really good to hear. That's like a great nugget for anyone listening, that sometimes just giving the space actually provides an opportunity of, well, actually, maybe I can handle this right now.
Right.
Or, in 20 minutes or an hour or something. Maybe that's what you need at that time. That's awesome. Well, this whole podcast is really to inspire and encourage wives and wholehearted intimacy in their marriage. And I'd love to hear maybe a scripture or a quote that's meant a lot to you over the years or even recently.
I was thinking about that. I mean, our ministry, our online ministry, when we asked God, to bless it, and I mean, because He asked us to share our story, and we asked Him to give us a scripture to confirm that, and He took us right to Ephesians 5, which is what He was working out in our marriage big time. So that's one that our whole ministry is built around. So I always like to talk about that one. But it was interesting when you said, something that recently God is working out in you. I just feel lately as we're working in marriages and talking with couples, there's just, we hear so many times in the Bible the theme of light and dark, of darkness and light. And I just feel there's so much of marriage that we hide in the darkness and with shame and just, feeling broken and something's wrong with me. And why isn't this thing that I wanted so much working? And so John 1:5, the light shines in the darkness and the darkness did not comprehend it. And that scripture, I've just been kind of working it out and thinking about it in my mind, and just this theme of that, if we bring our marriages into the light, if it's safe to do so in the church, the enemy, he doesn't really have the ability to attack, because, well, he'll still try, but because we're bringing our marriages into the light and we're exposing them to Jesus and saying, hey, I don't know how to do this on my own. I'm really confused. I need help. And Brad and I just feel like that the church should be the place for that our online ministries is amazing, but that, churches should be the place that marriages can go and can bring their marriage into the light, and it's safe to say, hey, I'm struggling in this area.
Wow, that's awesome. It's interesting that you mentioned in the light and the darkness. It's something I was trying to pull it up on my Bible, where I was just reading in another passage, but I can't remember exactly where it is. But the light and the darkness, thinking about even also exposing it to under God, you can bring it out in the open and not just be something you're struggling with in your own heart, but something that
Yeah.
you can present before him and see, God, what can you do with this? Where this is my brokenness, where shine the light,
Yeah.
show me what's really happening here. I
Absolutely.
love that so much.
Absolutely.
Now, when you say that, I want to dive into your story a little bit, what a struggle was for you all, because so often we go through these struggles and we think, like you said, we're the only ones going through it. So I think I've always found it really helpful to hear, no, everyone goes through struggles. Here's a really significant one.
Yeah.
So go right ahead.
I feel like we could share a novel on that. Yeah, we were, like I said, we were high school sweethearts, and we both went to colleges and separate colleges. So we were super excited to finally get married. And for us, we worked really hard, but we saved sex for marriage. And we just really had expectations and lofty dreams of, okay, now we're finally going to be married. Everything's going to be fantastic. And during a lot of our dating, we were at separate colleges. So we spent a lot of time apart. And, within the first year of our marriage, we were faced with a very different reality than what we thought marriage was going to be. And specifically, sex was a big misunderstanding for the two of us, something that we both really struggled with, understanding each other, understanding ourselves. And it quickly became a huge contention between the two of us. And specifically it was me. I was, we got married. I was like, this is going to be awesome. And for all purposes, it worked physically, but I started to, after the first couple weeks of marriage, be like, yeah, I could really take or leave this. Like, it's just not, just not, I struggled with desire for it, and not desire for my husband, but just desire to share that time with him. And so it quickly became a source of contention between the two of us. And I just was feeling so broken, like something was wrong with me, and, decided sticking my head in the sand was better than actually dealing with it. So I would say that was one of our most significant struggles, and it's why we talk about sex a lot on One Flesh Marriage. But it certainly wasn't our only struggle. We were definitely stuck in our own selfishness, and coming from being two single people to really struggling to putting the other first in marriage. And that included sex. But yeah, so the first 5 years of our marriage, I characterize them as very dark. Like, I feel like there was a cloud over our marriage. It just felt like we couldn't shake it. Anything we tried, we try something for a little while, be intentional, and then it would fall by the wayside. And after we were married about 5 years, God really sort of opened both of our eyes to some of the selfish, sinful things that we were doing in our marriage, and kind of was the wake up call. And we said, okay, we just can't continue on like this, because we're going to end up like those people who have children and look at each other and have no idea who they're married to anymore.
Yeah.
So we started to, what I would characterize as be intentional more often, but there was still a distance between us. There was still a lack of kind of being completely known as far as we can on this side of heaven. But we were trying, and I think we always say we think at that point we kind of had a good marriage. It was kind of that autopilot, like we can maintain this enough to make it good, but we would still have some heated exchanges, and which are normal, but to the point where they would bring separation between the two of us. And then at year 10, through some really crazy circumstances, God's just amazing. We were caring for my uncle who was sick and dying, and he was living with us. He had cancer. And during that time, I was just emotionally, physically exhausted, and just kept praying that God would break me, because I desired that, I wanted to serve this man, and I wanted to be broken for Christ, and kept praying that prayer. And little did I know that the first place he would choose to break me was my marriage. And this is all while things in our house are just crazy. And, he just spoke to my spirit and said, you need to do this with Brad. He's the person that I've given you to go through life with. You're trying to do it on your own. And so I started to just really seek Brad out in all sorts of ways, just emotionally, physically. I would just, when we'd be done caring for my uncle for the night, we would just go upstairs, and I would just, God just said, cling to him. And so I would just cling to him in all ways, talking to him and sharing and just saying, hey, I need you. But a lot of times I wasn't saying it in words. And so through that time, our relationship just really started to evolve and take off. It's just amazing what God does. And, so, through that time of crazy brokenness, God was able, my heart was open and willing to hear what he had to say about my marriage. And so that's where that was the catalyst for our marriage, kind of getting to the place where I say, okay, good was nice, and it was certainly better than the dark cloud of the first 5 years. But wow, God has so much more for marriage that Brad and I had no clue.
Well, I was actually going to say, she shares that time so much, reflecting on the places where God changed her or impacted her. And I'm sitting here hearing it again and just going, I think that's a huge part of our story, is that he was able to shift in both of us to see our own stuff. Because I see those same times and those same things, but in the light of God was really showing me things that I needed to change and I needed to do, and how selfish I was at different places, and how I was putting so many things in front of Kate. And, those are the things we used to have fights about all the time. And it really wasn't until God got a hold of both of us individually and started to say, you know what, you need to work on your stuff. And that we saw some pretty significant changes.
Wow. Can you share some of the details of what were the selfishness things that you would be willing to share? Sometimes that helps someone say, oh, that's something I need to work on, because they might not see it in themselves right now. Yeah.
For me, it was definitely like the first 5 years, it was definitely sticking my head in the sand about sex and just being like, you know what, I have no desire for it for the most part, so he's just gonna have to deal with it, like that kind of selfish, it only affects me kind of attitude. And honestly, years 5 to 10, we kind of talk about our marriage in increments of 5. For years 5 to 10, I was much more willing to show up to be there physically, because I was trying to understand him better, but I didn't realize how much that's still selfish, because, he knew I was just showing up physically. And while that's somewhat of a help, it's not what God designed sex to be. So that was one of my big selfish things. Probably the other one was that I would constantly want Brad to step up as the leader of our home, to be the strong leader. And yet, God really convicted me at one point during this time with my uncle. And he just said, how can Brad lead when you're standing in his way? Because I, in his lack of stepping up, I would take charge of things. Then it just became sort of a cycle of I needed control, and, I'd handle everything with the kids, and it would just be easier if he'd stay out of it. And, things needed fixed around the house, so I'll fix them or find someone who will fix them. And, those seem like silly things, but it undermines, your husband feeling like he is the leader of your family. And so, working on valuing sex in a relationship and seeing how, in our relationship, and seeing how and what God wants to do through that was a big one for me. And then also just learning to give Brad the reins of our family and to encourage him as he's doing so, to not just sit there begrudgingly, but to say, you know what, you're doing a good job. And now that I have, I just see the wisdom that God gives him that is just, so different from myself. And so I think those were two of the big selfish things that and probably within that, just learning that when I'm done for the day with the kids, our kids are, we have 3 kids. Our kids are 11, 10, and 8. And learning when I'm done for the day that it doesn't mean I'm just can check out. Like, it was just so easy to be done for the day and be like, okay, now it's my time. And instead it's, it's our time, and figuring out what that looks like between the two of us, and not just thinking selfishly, okay, I'm just going to go read my book or watch TV or whatever. And just, yeah. So those were probably the big things for me.
I'm so grateful, Kate, that you're so open about these things, because that's a really important thing. I think that, women need to understand, to be open. And so I'm just so grateful these details you're sharing, and being vulnerable in that way. And I want to just point out and ask your advice on, you mentioned selfishness a lot. And I think a lot of women struggle with saying, well, I'm not in the mood. How is that being selfish? Isn't that me just, being who I am? If I was in the mood, I would do that, but I'm not. What would you say to her?
Well, yeah, I totally was that girl for many years. And I would say, there is a time and a place for that. I mean, I think that every husband should respect those times when you're just like, you know what, just for me to wrap my brain around that right now is just too much. But for me, that was all too often. Like, I think that it just depends, if you're doing that here and there or whatever. But I would say that's the whole point of marriage. It's giving sometimes when we're not, there. And it's, hey, God, I need to rely completely on you tonight, because on my own, this isn't going to happen. And understanding very much so, and this isn't to guilt people, but, you, for both you and your husband, it is the only place the two of you can seek out sexual intimacy. So if you're just going to be like, well, you know what, I'm not in the mood constantly, that can become, it was a huge source of contention. And then that can become a place where temptation, the enemy is going to use that. And my challenge would just be to, I think for women, especially for if you're working full time or you have kids, it is sometimes hard to switch gears from, I just did the dishes, got the kids in bed, and now I have to think about you, and, but I think, I try to challenge women to go back to that time when it was just the two of you, and you could, you were constantly thinking about your husband. So, take those times to, hey, say to your husband, hey, just give me 20 minutes to take a bath or take a shower, and let me just shift gears. Because sometimes it's like, it's just so hard to go from one to the other. And, just learn those things about yourself. Learn things about yourself about, Brad and I, to be honest, like I said, we're an open book, so night times when we're really tired isn't the best time to try and, share that time together. So understanding that about yourself, if you can find a better time of the day that works with your schedules, then, just trying to understand that about yourself. I know that I've had to really think long and hard about God's plan for it. And once I finally put it in the proper place and the proper priority, it's amazing how much God has shown me through it and blessed me through it. And, it wasn't always easy at times. And I'll be honest, there are still times I just pray and I say, God, I know we need this tonight, and it's not just he needs it. I know we need this, but I know I'm not quite there, but I know that you can help me to get there, and to just try and focus on just my time with Brad and not the list of things that I need to do or, that kind of stuff. So were you going to say something?
I was just going to add, like, that's certainly not a one-sided list. I mean, there was a long time in our marriage where I would, kind of check out from 8 o'clock till 11 o'clock in front of the TV, and then show up in her bedroom and be disappointed that she wasn't ready to go. And we kind of chuckle about that now, but I not only did that, but really had no clue how stupid that was. So, I think there's a lot of places where it was both of us who were not prioritizing the other's need, because I didn't recognize how important it was for Kate, for us to be connecting emotionally in conversation, and even expressing my desire to her through the day. Because she needed that to kind of think through it and get her mind around it. I didn't ever recognize that. And so then I'd be disappointed when she wasn't ready at the drop of a hat. But that's not
Right.
how she's designed to be. So
Mm.
this was definitely two-sided.
Gotcha. Okay. So, and I was going to ask you if you could share some details on the selfish. So that's what you would say is that
Yeah,
your
well, there's
default.
some of that I would say some of my selfishness in the sexual arena was definitely
Mm-hmm.
thinking through my own lenses of desire, not really recognizing anything about her. So I think there's that side. I think there's definitely other places I was selfish. One of the bigger lessons that I had was just recognizing how much I put what I was doing at work
Yeah.
as my giving to my family and my wife.
Mm.
And I still remember driving home one day, just mentally checking out from a hard day at work and saying, man, I can't wait to just, do nothing tonight. And that was my
Mm.
mindset.
Yeah.
And it kind of just hit me of, wait a minute, I'm going home to, at that point, we had two kids and going home to
Yeah.
a toddler and an infant, a wife who's been together all day. And all I want to do is check out. That's a problem. And I just started to challenge myself that I needed to not give my wife and my family my leftovers, but kind of figure out
Mm.
how do I give them me when I come
Yeah.
home. Because I have to be more than just a paycheck, because that's not all I give to them. Obviously, that's
Right.
important, but there's got to be more there, and that's a huge part of that selfishness for me. Was just I check out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm really grateful that you said that. I love that you said you started to look at your wife through the lens of, sorry, you were looking at your marriage through the lens of your own desire.
Yeah.
And you've had to switch that to be looking at through the lens of her desire, what makes
Mm-hmm.
her crave sexual intimacy, and how can I give that to her. And I just love that. And I'm interested, Kate, when you mentioned when I just love both perspectives on this, because, Brad's saying that, I had some issues that I needed to deal with. And Kate's like, well, I also had issues that I needed to deal with. Kate, what would you say to the wife that's saying, how am I supposed to feel sexy and give him this wonderful intimacy when he's not there for me, when he's not even making me feel appreciated, much less ready to go at the end of the day? What would you say to her?
Yeah. It's a great question. I think that, I think the thing that I say to women when they're most struggling and they don't know, and they feel like you said, their husband's just not attentive or not kind of in tune with their needs. The thing that brought about the biggest change in our marriage was me taking the initiative to do what I needed to do. And I think it's one of the hardest things to tell people, because they're like, oh, so that's what it is. I have to change. And I get that that's tough, but when you have a cycle of two people being selfish and neither one wanting to change, you just keep the cycle going. And the only way to stop the cycle is for one person to step up and say, okay, God, I'm willing to be used by you in this marriage and do what you're calling me to do. And if we dive into the word, especially in Ephesians 5, we see specifically what he's calling wives to do. And, I challenge wives, just read the part for you. Don't read the part about your husbands, because you're going to sit there and say he's not doing it. But that's not a reason or a license to not do what he's calling you to do. And so, Brad will say, I was the first one to start changing in our marriage.
Absolutely.
And when I started to do that, he naturally wanted to start reciprocating.
I won't even say it was natural. It was like there was that point that she was saying that she just really felt God saying to cling to me, and she didn't tell me that at the time. She just was, something was definitely different. And I remember, honestly, probably 2 or 3 days into that, saying, oh, this is nice. And then probably 2 weeks into that, saying to myself, I'm not sure I want to ask what changed, because I'm afraid I'm going to make it go away. But the reality is, by the time we did start talking about it, she was seeing changes in me that I was not intentionally doing. It was, a response from, wow, I'm really feeling loved from her. So I want to make her feel loved too. And like, it really does work. It's just really hard to do. And
it really, we're still unwrapping what God's desire is for sexual intimacy, and I'm amazed at the things that He shows us. But it really does soften you towards each other, and you're so much more able to extend grace and understanding to each other when you're able to share that. And so I would just challenge wives that it may be hard, and it's some of the hardest advice that I can give, and yet I think that it's the only way to go. You've got to seek God out and what He wants you to do as a wife, and just ask Him to help you do that, to make some of those changes that you need to make, and do it selflessly, not wondering or expecting response from your husband for him to change. I mean, in our story, that did happen, and people often say, oh, so if I do what God asked me, then my husband will do what God's asking him. And unfortunately, that's not a guarantee, because we all have free will, we all have choices. But I do believe it is the way to, one of the biggest ways that you can bring about change in your marriage is to just step up and say, okay, God, what do you want me to do?
Yeah.
And that includes sex.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Very good. I love, you mentioned, once I put sex in the proper priority, I'm amazed how God blessed me through it, which I just love that insight that once you take that step of faith and are like, you know what, I'm just going to go for it. And then, look at the rewards, and that's amazing. I want to ask, if you don't mind getting a little more just clear on, you said you got the 5 years where it's just really bad, then 5 years of kind of getting better little by little. And then there was this moment when your uncle died or was dying, that all of a sudden you just felt you needed to really give yourself to him. Can you just kind of share what that means for a wife when she's like, what does that mean?
Yeah. All I know is that in that time I was like, the only way I can explain it is I spent a lot of sleepless nights just because of the stress and worry with my uncle. And it really wasn't a bad time for us. It was just a draining time. And so sometimes I would just be sitting up at night and I would just be talking to God. And I had read a book in that time, and there was a character in the book that just kept praying, break me, Lord, until I'm wholly yours. And I wanted that so much. I just wanted to be broken. And so, I just started praying a dangerous prayer, and, I just kept praying it every day, and God spoke audibly to my spirit and just said, cling to your husband. He's the one who I've given you to go through life with, to go through this with. And so I have to be honest, he said that to me, and I was like, what does that mean? Like, what am I supposed to do? So I just remember one of the first nights, okay, God, I can do this. After the kids were in bed, we were upstairs. My uncle was all checked on. I just literally just went over to Brad, and we were just snuggling. And I was just like, okay, I'm just going to cling to him. I didn't really know what that meant, but here he is. He's who God, So physically, I just clung to him and started doing that every single night. And I can honestly say that when you're physically doing that, it wasn't hard for one thing to transition into the other. And many times sex would be a part of that. But also sometimes we would just lay there and I would just cling to him and we would just talk. We would just talk about, my day and his day, because he was still going out being the provider for our family while all this is going on, and coming home and helping me with the kids, and, and my uncle, he was a great help with that. And so,
for me, I mean, a big part of that time was, we had conversations that probably every couple has, like, we're going into a new season of life right now that's going to be incredibly busy for her because she's going to be taking care of her uncle and doing all of this stuff. And so I remember just kind of saying, okay, for the next couple of months, it is going to be nuts. We're not going to really have a whole lot of time together. And I just kind of almost geared myself up for that. As I'm sure a lot of couples go through those times. So that's what I was expecting. And I'm sure out of that came me going, telling myself, all right, I'm going to have to do more around the house, or I'm going to have to be, recognizing that she's not going to be here for me. And then the total opposite was what was happening, where she was being purposeful about, coming and finding me and asking about my day and being there for me, and even just snuggling up to me. Like, those kind of things were totally opposite of what I'd kind of prepared myself for. So it was definitely interesting interesting, amazing time.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that answered your question, but it's a hard time to like express. I just know God spoke to me and I wasn't sure what it exactly looked like. So I just kind of stepped out in faith and was like, okay, I'm just going to cling to him physically and see what God's, that's what God said. And we're just going to start with that. And it was amazing to see how that within like 3 weeks, like the two of us were kind of like in awe of our marriage, which was kind of crazy.
Well, and I will also say it definitely comes out of a time of prayer too, because I will say this was God making both of us ready to receive some of this, because if I was still at some of the places I had been, she would have been cuddled up to somebody who was focused on the TV. But God had been working with me on, all right, I need to drop some of that to make space. And so there was kind of his timing and in all that too.
Definitely.
Wow. Well, there's just so many great pieces of this. I just want to pull out one part that strikes me is the morality kind of question in this moment of when you're caring for someone that's suffering. And I imagine, did he die after, that season?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So very sad. And then sometimes it's just amazing how God uses those really difficult times where you're just confronted with the morality of, am I living the life that God wants me to live? And then maybe I'm not, maybe there's some changes I need to make. And I just think that's really interesting. And then I love that it was so clear that, God gave you the green light to enjoy sex. He gave you a very specific, this is good. And I want this for you.
Definitely.
And it's just wonderful, because I think a lot of times we get it in our minds, wives especially, that this is not something, this is separate from God. This is not my relationship with God. This is dirty and bad or somehow, and I think that if we can just get a revelation that this is God's design, it's huge. And that this came out of, just like Brad said, a time of prayer where you're seeking God, wanting to be broken. And he says, well, go have sex with your husband. It just seems so unlike what we think of God so often, but it's so much a part of who he is and what he wants for us in our lives. I love that.
Absolutely.
I want to ask Brad about what was that difference that you said, well, I don't want to say anything, but this is kind of great. I mean, what could you just define that as? What was it?
Well, all right. We'll put it out there. At that point in our marriage, we were probably that once a week kind of couple.
Yeah.
But the change from that,
I would say once to twice, but that was good because we had really like those last 5 years.
That's a much improvement where we had been, but at that point we were, and going from once a week to 4 or 5 times a week, that was noticeable. That was definitely like a change. But even it was just her demeanor, because I knew how stressed she was. I knew how much she was giving of herself, but then she was happily, thinking about where my stress was, which doesn't, I noticed those kind of things. And she was wanting to make sure that we were, connecting and talking and those kind of things in the midst of all of the other chaos going around. So I think that was part of that.
Thank you so much for sharing. It just gives, I think, women just a clear kind of, okay, what can I do practically? What can I actually do? So I just love that. So it sounds like you kind of narrowed it down to one, the frequency, much more, which is awesome. And the second of her attitude towards it, her demeanor, her desire for it.
Yeah. And I would say desire for just wanting to spend time with me, and maybe it's
closeness.
Right. There's a win there that, my love language is quality time. Yeah. So I was definitely feeling like she's saying, hey, I want to spend time with you in the midst of all this chaos. Like that was definitely feeding my love language specifically. So I think that was certainly part of that.
Well, and I think there is that aspect of, I think women can struggle with this, of just checking the sex off, like saying that we had it once or twice a week. Like I had come to realize that it was a need in our marriage, but it was like, okay, let me get my 1 to 2 times in a week and check it off my list. So, we can check it off and we can be done. And the difference of just seeking you out for that because of the closeness that it was bringing us. And that's not to say, I can be completely honest, that I don't still go through seasons where I have to tell myself and I have to pray and I have to seek God and say, okay, God, I'm struggling, because desire is something that I still struggle with. But now I know, it's hard to explain, but now I know God's good purposes for it. So I know that sometimes, it sounds bad, but sometimes pushing through is helpful.
Well, I mean, I actually don't think it sounds too bad, because I think of something I really love is going to the gym. I really love the gym. When I leave the gym, I am on top of the world, man. You can't get me down. I spent time in worship music. I spent time talking to God. I got my body moving, all this stuff. But there are so many mornings. In fact, this morning, I did not make it to the gym.
Yeah.
And yet I know how wonderful it is. And I know how God speaks to me during that time. And so I think of that as sex. A lot of times we sometimes need to get ourselves there before we can even feel the wonderful effects. And and I think that's different for men and women a lot of times, not all, but.
And I've done a couple of posts on this, that a lot of times I'm not completely into it until we're halfway into it. And I think that is a lot of times how women function. And so just knowing that about myself, that, hey, okay, so right now I need a little bit more convincing and whatnot, but once we get there, I'm going to be totally into it. It's just, my mind is there. It's just getting your body to respond in the same way. And, and that's just part of how it is. And women will often say to me, and I hear so many times, why did God make it such a struggle for us then? And it's not always women that struggle. There are men out there that struggle too, because we definitely hear from them as well. I would just say that, if it was something that came to us so easy as putting food in our mouths, well, it wouldn't be the blessing that it is, because it would just be like any other thing you do during the day. And so it takes the two of us really, working together and having that selflessness of, okay, how can I please you in this? It's just the dynamic that God wants to make it a blessing. It has to be something that's, you seek out, and it's a mystery, and you're still unfolding it and unwrapping it. And as we grow and change in marriage, it changes with us and we change. And so you have to continue to unwrap it and figure it out. And, I just think that's part of it. And though it may at times seem to be, that's hard, I think it is part of the blessing.
Yeah, that's awesome. Brad, can I ask, how does it feel for you as a husband to kind of know the struggle with Kate, and just to kind of speak to women that might be concerned, like, well, if my husband knew my desire wasn't so high, or if, maybe even there hasn't been some honesty in the bedroom of even wanting at certain times, or, there's a lot of dishonesty sometimes when it comes around sex, and
absolutely,
to hear what she actually feels about it, how does it make you feel?
Yeah, there's kind of both sides to that. I think, it was really good for me to start hearing her say things like, I knew I was just showing up sometimes, because I was feeling that and not sure why that was, because I think all men harbor this desire to make their wives really want sex. And not only, they feel like, and I think sometimes society says this, if you're good at it, then your wife will really want it. And so I think there is that sometimes that failure behind them that feels well, if my wife doesn't want it, then that means I'm not good at it, or something like that, which is really it's pretty silly, but I think that feeling is there. So it's, I think it was honestly during the time of our blogging, when we had to talk about this a whole lot more, that we started having more and more conversations about what works for you, what actually do you enjoy, what don't you enjoy. And those conversations are really important to have, but most couples don't have them. They don't get to the place of saying, help me understand this when you're saying I'm need some more encouragement. To me, that doesn't make sense, because I'm not wired that way. So what does that mean? And does that mean that you want it but you don't yet, or just help me understand that. And I think those kind of things just understanding each other's, how our mind and our bodies work together and how different they are, has been really helpful.
I would add to that too, is just for women understanding the difference, and maybe they don't feel this way, but I felt broken because I desired my husband, but I didn't desire sex. And I know that sounds confusing, but I never looked at Brad and thought, oh, I don't want to have sex with this man. He's not unattractive. I find him very sexy, very attractive. And once we would have sex, I would enjoy it. It was getting to that point, getting over my own mind issues of gearing up and we did find out after our son was born, our oldest, that birth control very much lowered my desire level. So knowing that was important. Unfortunately, we were young when we got married, and we did not look into those things very well. We just thought convenience was the best sort of option. And, I do talk to women lots of times about looking at other options, because it really can mess with your hormone levels. And, but, I can honestly say that I never didn't desire Brad, but as, my desire issues for sex became a problem, it would put a distance between us. And I do think that he felt like I didn't desire him. And I can see how it would feel that way. But there wasn't that, I've always enjoyed my time with him and just find him incredibly attractive. And so, but I do really think one can lead to the other. Like if you desire your husband, struggling with desire for sex, and you don't deal with it, eventually you don't desire your husband either, because you've just let it get to the point where it consumed you.
Wow. That's really good. That's really good insight, because it's definitely, I'm right there with you, Kate. I will absolutely look at my husband across the room, or, when he's doing pull-ups on our chin-up bar in our house or whatever, I'm just like, wow, what a sexy man I have. And then it doesn't necessarily translate into the bedroom. It's just like, and so I just love that you're sharing that. Now, when you mentioned birth control kind of dampening the desire, I just, as a disclaimer, you're not a doctor, but can you kind of suggest something that has helped or that has worked?
Honestly, I would just say research. I would just say to any couples that if they're struggling with it and they are using birth control, to maybe research it, and no, we're not doctors, but when I went off it and was pregnant with our son, it was like a whole world of difference. And I wouldn't say, Brad was even like, wow, this is different. So, and that was, we had him at year 4. So that was in our marriage. So that was the time we were kind of, just really recognizing, different things. So my advice always to young couples is just research things and think about them and realize that anything you're putting into your body changes it changes things about you. It's obviously keeping you from being able to, conceive a child. So it's going to change things, and just being an advocate for yourself and looking up things and making sure you're understanding what something does to your body. We're certainly not preaching one thing over the other. And if somebody uses oral birth control, that's totally fine. But neither of us, while I was struggling with this, ever really thought about it. It was until we stopped taking it and had our son that I was like, oh, this is different.
This is better.
And we hadn't had sex before marriage. So and we're the only people we've ever been with. So I had no idea. I just started taking birth control 3 or 4 months before we got married. So I had no idea, and so just understanding that anything you put into your body is going to affect it and change it, and potentially, and just knowing what you're dealing with.
Cool. Yeah. Well, that's great advice. And I wanted to just kind of, before we move on to kind of the next section, I want to ask Brad about, I love that you said that in our society, men feel like, well, if I'm good at it, then she's going to want it more. Can you just unpack that a little bit more for what that means for a man?
I think, men this is a tough one, but most men not only have a desire for sex, they have a desire that their spouse enjoys it as well, that it's mutually beneficial. And I've heard from so many guys that feel like, their wife is just showing up kind of thing, which and they're actually saying that sometimes that's almost worse than when we didn't have it, because showing up is just like, it's a release, but that's all it is. It's not an intimacy, it's not a connection, because it feels like she's doing it out of obligation and I'm not doing it well enough to make her enjoy it. And that's all of that is not necessarily true. Like, there's some definitely falsehoods in that beliefs, but I think it's important that, wives understand that your husband really, really desires to make this work for you. And if it's not working, if, whether it's in the moment that it's not working or even in desire it's not working, he wants to learn how to do better. And I think there's a place where he just sometimes needs education and sometimes needs encouragement, and
Mm-hmm.
That's good. Yeah, that's really good. And I wonder if it's not just a conversation that a wife listening can have with her husband. Honey, do you feel like I'm just showing up sometimes? How does that feel to you?
Mm-hmm.
Just that honesty, bringing some honesty into the bedroom is huge. And maybe literally, maybe it's not when you're in the bedroom about to start. Maybe it's
probably not.
Right. It's usually right after. That's the best time. But we heard from one couple, this was a little while ago, that she was just frustrated because her husband did the same thing in the bedroom every time. And unpacking that, like, the reality is there was one time back a long time ago that thing worked. Well, he thought, hey, it worked then, let me just do it again and it'll work again. And so didn't really understand that that's not necessarily how she works. That's not, and just needed to unpack, how do I functionally, make her enjoy this? Because, I thought I had the secret formula, and there is no secret formula, but it's helping guys understand that. And I think wives can be a huge help in that, in having that conversation and just saying, you know what, I really like this position more. Or I really like, when you do this, or I don't like it when you do this. Not as a negative, but just say, instead of that, could you do this? Like, those are actually positive conversations that most of the time your husband would be happy to have.
Well, I just think we have to, with those kind of conversations, we just have to enter them both listening really well and not taking offense, understanding that it's to understand each other better. That's what intimacy is, just knowing each other more and more. And I think, too many times people have built up walls and they just take offense when somebody wants to have a conversation like that, when one of the spouses wants to have a conversation. And so, just breaking down those walls and saying, I'm just trying to share, from my heart, what works for you, what I enjoy, and just trying to listen and hear each other and not take offense to what's being said.
I just think that's so good. And I actually misunderstood you, Brad. So you're saying that the best time to talk about a good, to talk is right after the afterglow of sex. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yeah, that's often a really good time to have good conversations about lots of topics, because chemically, emotionally, everything, like, you guys are in a place that you're feeling pretty connected. That's right. We often, one of the studies that I love to quote often is that they've done some research on, like, connection and sex, and wives feel the most desire for sex when they feel the most connected in their marriage, where husbands feel the most connected in their marriage just after having sex. Wow. And so sometimes, like, that difference actually, like, that often talks a lot about, like, when you have a conflict, if your husband wants to have sex right away and you're like, wait, we're in the middle of a conflict, it's usually because of that, because they're like, hey, if we just have sex, we'll be connected and everything will be fine. And you're, the wife is saying, wait a minute, we need to get through this before I can even think about the desire to have that. So sometimes that after time, you're both feeling pretty connected. And that's a good time to sometimes have those conversations.
If you can keep them awake.
There you go.
Well, hey, there are times that it's perfect time to take a nap too.
There you go. And usually you feel connected after that.
That's right.
Very good. So I just, brilliant. Okay, so wives feel the most desire for sex when they feel most connected in their marriage, and husbands feel the most connected in their marriage after they have sex with their husband, their
Right.
wife.
Yeah.
Oh, so good. That's awesome. Well, you're going to have to stay tuned until Thursday to hear the second half of this awesome interview. Just so good. So I'm going to also invite you to the webinar. Once again, that is tonight. And I am so excited. Please set your alarm for 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you haven't signed up, do so immediately. That's 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I would just be so honored if you could be there with me. It's live, it is free, and we really dive into what God has to say about your marriage, intimacy, and some spicy topics that you would be really surprised are outlined in the Bible. I believe God has got some really amazing things to share with you. And I just keep getting feedback, trickling in that people have really been impacted by that webinar. Again, I don't record them because I want it to be an intimate, real conversation between the two of us. And so it feels like the two of us, just so you know, because you won't ever hear or see any of the other people that are on there because it's totally anonymous. But, I would love for you to be there. I think God has got some awesome things he wants you to find out about your husband. So again, it's called How to Love Him Most, and you can sign up at delightyourmarriage.com/webinar. Thank you so much. God bless you, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks for listening. If you've been blessed by this, why not share it? Until next time, live with love, wisdom, and passion.